Hey, what's going on? This is Devin Hillsdon-Smith, your host of Site Selectors Are People 2, and we are back in Season 2. Man, we made it through an entire first season. We're in the second one. That's typically what happens. 2 comes after 1. And you're all still here. That's a huge deal. I mean, I have received feedback. Just let me talk out loud for a second here. This isn't about bragging. This is about being a little dumbfounded. I've received feedback via emails, text messages, LinkedIn, Facebook. I got a random phone call. Don't know how that person got my phone number, but it was good feedback. I'm really pleased the direction this thing's going. So we took a week off between season 1 and season 2, right? And the next episode you're going to hear after this one is going to be one of our stories from the road. In fact, the next 2 might be stories from the road. We have a number of episodes that have been recorded thus far, and I'm just trying to figure out how to properly insert them, I guess, into the regular cadence of the podcast so that it's not confusing, right? So I'll try to flag when we're going into a stories from the road. But generally speaking, I think moving forward, expect to hear more of those. I've received a lot of good feedback on us having guests on this podcast, which is both a delight to hear as well as a backhanded criticism that you don't want to hear from me anymore. Just talking all the way through. Anyways, folks, glad to have you back. Speaking of feedback and interaction with our listening public here, this one's going to be a shorter podcast episode, but it's going to be in response to a review I got on Apple Podcasts. And I'm just going to go ahead and read that for you real quick. It was some really, really good feedback or advice from somebody who is not in this profession that wanted to learn more. So let me pull this up. All right. So it says, I am learning a lot about how these things work. I had no idea. Any way you can talk about how the community can become more involved before anything is final. Public input seems like last on the list. I'm curious on your take. Bravo. Very, very relevant comment or question about this profession. So for this episode, we're going to focus on enhancing public engagement in confidential site selection. We're going to look at how we can balance public insight and confidentiality in site selection. So again, this is going to be a shorter episode. We're going to take a quick break in the middle, but I hope this is interesting and scratches the itch of that listener. So let's get started. Why is it that these projects that are announced, these game-changing, community-changing projects, why is it that the public at large is given so little time to provide input, right? So let's stick into confidentiality. These projects, as I've talked about on a prior episode, the process runs covered in confidentiality from effectively beginning to end. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? There's a couple of reasons why confidentiality is essential. Protecting business strategies, protecting or preventing against undue speculation, managing competitive interests. There's a reason why non-disclosure agreements are legally protected in this country. Typically, from my experience, a company that engages us to conduct a site selection project, typically they are doing so in a very high stakes, high risk environment. If company X is a publicly traded company and they're one of the top 3 in the nation, any move that they make is highly scrutinized by not only the competition, but by the market itself. And so if company X was to make public to the world that they were considering the build of a brand new factory, which is going to cost them and their shareholders $800 million, and going to add X number of dollars per year over the next 20 years projected to run and operate, I mean, it's acceptable to take that point of view and recognize that, company X might not want its competition to understand where it's going in the future, especially in an industry that is highly competitive with low margins and every little decision counts. If that company X, is publicly traded, you also have to be very careful about the information that is brought into the public conscience, right? The public market, publicly traded companies are highly regulated in every sophisticated country. And so if a company is simply trying to determine the best location for a potential new factory that they may not build if the right location isn't out there, or if this isn't the right time, they're interacting with regulations for publicly traded companies that put a lot of scrutiny upon them. So you've got competition, you've got regulations, you've got the market. There's a multitude of justifiable reasons why a company needs to be extremely guarded as they're investigating where they are going to potentially put down their next operation. And so, like I said before, confidentiality measures like non-disclosure agreements, closed-door negotiations, those are pervasive in this industry. So it's pretty clear that for a company to make a solid decision and not impact a whole host of different issues that could come with making such a decision, it's pretty clear that confidentiality is critical, right? But the question that was asked was about, okay, that's great, but if let's localize that. If our community is being considered, and this is an $800 million investment with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of new jobs, but we know it's industrial as well, don't we have the right to comment on the impact of that company's investment, of their operations? What if it's a heavy industry, operation that has the potential to emit significant criteria pollutants into the air, or take up a significant portion of our wastewater treatment plant that raises rates for us? It's not beyond the realm of comprehension to understand that a community kind of wants to know what's coming next, right? Especially if it has this big of an impact on them. So incorporating public input can help align projects with community values, ensuring local support and smoother implementation. So despite the criticality, is that a word? Despite the critical role that confidentiality plays in site selection projects, we have to consider the advantages that come with community engagement, such as fostering local job creation, infrastructure improvements, rebutting against potential issues that come with industry that the community may not want. It's going to come out eventually. It's going to come out eventually. And so we're going to get a break. And when we come back, we're going to discuss how the public can get more involved and how already the mechanisms for the public to get involved are, well, they're kind of already in place. They might just not be as evident as we expected. Talk to you soon. All right, and we're back. Getting to the crux of the listener's question, what is the right time for the public to be able to get engaged? And, a suggestion embedded within that question was right now, this standard, the typical time the public's engaged is kind of a little too late. It's kind of like when the project's already baked and they're being asked if they even want to eat it, right? But there is value in public input. So the current public engagement practice, well, there's various methods used currently to involve the public without compromising confidentiality. So you can conduct structured town halls with general discussions about codename projects that have general details provided. There could be workshops amongst community leaders to gather community feedback through going out to your respective constituents on broader concerns or potential impacts of a project. There could be discussions around the formation of advisory boards, including, again, community leaders under confidentiality agreements. Typically, here's what happens. You go through 6 to 9 months of the site selection process. And within those 6 to 9 months, only the site selection team, and therefore the corporate client, and the economic development team, and therefore utilities and the state and localities, but various government leaders and nonprofit leaders that operate within this arena, within those 6 to 9 months, when you take it from, in a very hyperbolic manner, from 0 to 90% of the project being done, there's only a very small group of individuals involved that are vetting the project and the community as being the right match. And so while you could have what I just said as current public engagement practices, you could have structured town halls and workshops and advisory boards, those typically don't come about until the last 10% of the project, hence the question or the feedback from the listener. So how can we be better at this? Well, you have to remember, of the parties that I've mentioned, on the community side, you've got your economic development team. You've got your political leadership from both the state and the local levels. So it's not like entities that were either elected by the public or appointed through elected officials don't have any say-so into what's going on. But I guess I'm hesitating here because I guess we're talking about maybe the differentiation is direct involvement versus indirect involvement. And maybe it's that direct involvement is not the right way to get this done, because we all have to recognize that we have to balance confidentiality and transparency, right? Direct involvement, knowing the company, exactly what they're going to do, etc. Well, if that was demanded by a community, they would never have any sort of company suggest a significant investment there, right? And that's, we could back off and say, well, then, screw corporate America. But I think, again, back to my original point, it's acceptable that companies need some level of confidentiality as they're trying to make decisions, especially if they're publicly traded. So let's just assume direct involvement by the public is out of the question. I think the answer here is indirect involvement. It's making sure that your community leadership, your publicly elected officials, your economic development teams, make sure that they understand and are able to have their finger on the pulse of the community. So instead of assuming that you're going to be given the opportunity to sit down with a company and almost interview them about why we should allow you to be in this community, knowing that that's not realistic, recognize that you have a representative in these discussions in that first 90% of the project, which is your economic development team, which is appointed or contracted by your publicly elected officials. You have a voice. We have a voice. I'm not saying it works out every time, but if you have a strong economic development organization with an ironclad agreement, contract, or arrangement with your publicly elected officials, departments or commissions or councils, then you do have an opportunity to ensure that the projects that come to your community are those that the community actually wants. Your publicly elected officials and your economic development teams should consistently be representing your interests as the public. Plain and simple. An economic development team is not simply there to win projects. It might feel that way based on headlines and marketing that goes out from those teams, but they are there to work on behalf of the community, day in and day out. Let me give you an example. In a community that I'm familiar with, never worked there before, but I'm quite familiar with, the economic development team, and in this case, this is an example of it gone the wrong way. So just as an example why economic development teams understand that they need to have the community's best interests in mind, not just the idea of winning, right? So in this community, the economic development team spent 13 months chasing a project. I forget the code name of the project, so we're just going to call it Project, I'm going to do what I normally do, look around my office here. Project Wall. Fantastic, Devin. Project Wall. Great. Project Wall first approached this community by way of the economic development team, proposing $900 million of investment, 450 brand new jobs paying significant wages. And by the way, $900 million worth of investment, it's a big, big bill. These days, with all these mega projects floating around, 900 doesn't even seem like that much. So I just want to clarify, this was pre-COVID and pre the mega project era, when 900 million would get anybody in economic development out of their bed in the morning. So $900 million investment, what did I say, 450 jobs paying well above the county average wage, good manufacturing. That economic development organization for 13 months chased it like it was the only thing saving them from ruin. They had their eyes on the prize constantly. The problem is, and this is actually a good story to tell because I'm going to contradict myself here, but we're going to finish it out. The problem was this economic development organization was so focused on the huge investment, the significant number of jobs, the ability to raise the county average wage, which are three things that any community in this country would want. But they forgot that the company's operations that were being proposed were heavy, dirty operations. And dirty is an unfair term. And I learned this, and I know this from my time doing regulatory environmental affairs for the state. But in this case, dirty was the right term. This was going to be a cardboard box manufacturing facility. For those of you that don't know how these things operate, there are significant environmental emissions that come off of these plants. They're necessary, right? And the industry is getting better and better and better. But this specific one that I'm talking about from years ago had not implemented any sort of technology to make it any better than just the typical way that these plants are operated. And so there was a significant potential impact to the wastewater treatment plant. this specific operation itself would have smelled pretty horrifically. It wasn't necessarily the right operation to locate next to a higher-end residential neighborhood and, within throwing distance of kind of the core of the downtown where folks go to enjoy and to live their lives in that community. And so the point of this story is that the economic development team did not consider whether or not this would be considered a NIMBY, not in my backyard, by the community. And so they pushed it forward for as long as they did. And when they finally announced it, assuming that everybody was going to be so proud and so happy to have this new company come into town, they, in short, were wrong. They were wrong. The number of articles and op-eds posted in the local media, the amount of individuals finally given the opportunity to come out to town halls and scream at them. How dare you bring this type of operation to our community? Do you not know better? Here was the impact of my point of all of this. Despite all the time spent and all the representations made by the Economic Development Organization, the company, even though they were ready to pull the trigger, they had to walk away. And not only did that impact the credibility of the Economic Development Organization with the community, but that had a significant negative impact on the company's timeline for making a decision and starting to operationalize, starting to deploy capital, starting to build their brand new facility. They had to, well, I don't know if they'd start over, if they had to go to the second place or the third place. I don't actually know where that went, but it was the wrong move for everybody. So there's two kind of lessons from this. Number one, if you're asking why the public doesn't get an opportunity to weigh in sooner, my response is that you do, by way of your publicly elected officials and those appointed to or contracted to do economic development efforts on behalf of your community. They should already know, if you have a strong voice in your community, they should already know what you want and what you don't want. How do you do that? You go to public development meetings. You go to zoning meetings. Anything that relates to land use in your community, you need to consider those meetings to be as important as anything else that you attend. If you are an engaged citizen, you need to make your voice heard. Because the economic development organizations and your publicly elected officials are not looking to screw you. They're not. If you can provide effective, efficient feedback in those forums that are provided to you, you give your economic development teams that are on the front lines negotiating with confidential projects, you give them the feedback they need to know when they should go after projects and when they shouldn't. Now, if your community does not provide you with those types of forums for you to provide that feedback, you have a bigger issue, and you need to take that up with your elected officials, because that's wrong. But you have the opportunity, because the other lesson to be learned from the story that I told was that economic development organization failed. And so there is the risk that your economic development organization will fail you. But it is up to you, just as much as it is up to them, to make sure that the whims and the ethos of the community, that the needs and the desires and the requirements put forth by the community are clearly heard by your economic development team. I, as a site selector, would be ashamed if I brought a project to a community and we went that far down the path to only find out on the back end when we make it public that the community didn't actually want my client there. It's not good for anybody. So, to the listener that asked the question, amen. Amen, brother. Amen, sister. It's something that I can't even tackle in one episode, and I don't think that I would ever find the right answer, because I don't think anybody can. But there are best practices associated with how do you balance public engagement and project confidentiality. You need to have a strong connection between the public and its leaders. If that's there, then hopefully every project announcement you hear of will be exciting, will be what the community wants, and will be in line with what the community is. So, to the listener, I hope that was enlightening. To everybody else, I hope that was, well, I also hope it was enlightening. I don't have the right answers here. This is a complicated topic, but it's the type of conversation that I want us to have on these podcasts, right? The intersection between confidentiality and public transparency is one that it has a bit of a personality disorder, that intersection. There's a conflict between transparency and confidentiality at its core. And both aspects, when it comes to working projects, are critical, as we've outlined in this episode. So, I'm going to end it there. I would love to hear back from anybody who has listened to this podcast about your thoughts as to how I've addressed this difficult topic. And I would love to have an opportunity to engage with those thoughts on a future episode. But for now, I do actually have a request for you. First of all, I have a few requests. First of all, for your own communities, I want to encourage you to participate in community forums and discussions related to local development. I want to encourage you to do something about the public's engagement with economic development projects. Even if you just go to one meeting, do it. Go to one, see what the discussion's like, and if you're so compelled to continue going and maybe start speaking, do it. Be a voice for your community. So that's my first, what do they call in podcasting? Call to action. Get involved. You can also reach out to me if you want to have more conversations about this. If you'd like some thoughts, if you've decided you wanted to go in and speak your voice, but you don't feel as though you don't have enough experience and you want to talk to somebody first, reach out to me on LinkedIn, on Facebook at Site Selectors Are People too. Here's my other call to action, and this is more self-centered, and please indulge me here. I would greatly appreciate, I've just learned that this is a big deal. We have a fantastic listener base so far, but I want to make this thing bigger because I'm loving the idea that folks that have no idea what this profession is or what we all do for their communities on a day in, day out basis, I want to reach more. So if you could simply go to Apple Podcasts, go to Site Selectors Are People too, and leave a 5-star review, if that's how you feel, man, I would appreciate it. That would really help to boost it. If you don't feel like leaving 5 stars, then, you're more than welcome to still go, but appreciate it if you didn't. Reach out to me directly, maybe. Ooh, there's that confidentiality and transparency thing coming up again. But seriously, if you're enjoying this podcast and you want to see us grow, please go to Apple Podcasts, Site Selectors Are People too, and leave a 5-star review. It would be greatly appreciated. And as you heard from this episode, I read every single one of them. So we're going to end there. I hope you've enjoyed the first episode of Season 2 of Site Selectors Are People too. And you can look forward to next Monday being a story from the road with an individual that has a fascinating story to tell. And man, do we dig into it. So, again, this is Devin Hillsdon-Smith with Site Selectors Are People too, and I hope you have the best week ever. See ya. Just a heads up, views expressed in this podcast are solely my own and are not attributable to any employers, whether past or present. Thank you.